uh, with the reading assignments. Everybody knows what to read. You've all got the reader. And I want you to read an article in there that I wrote called Collective Intentions in Action. And that article really cost me a lot of work. The problem is to try to figure out if you think that collective intentionality is irreducible, that you can't reduce it to individual intentionality, as I think you can't, then you have a serious problem. Well, what's the content of the collective intentionality when I'm doing one thing and you're doing something else, and we're both doing it collectively as part of a collective enterprise? And I try to answer that question. Most of the people who write about this think that that's the wrong way to go about it. They think that that it has to all reduce to I intend, that it would be crazy to think that there is an irreducible we. And I think there is. I think it's part of our biological capacity for cooperation, that we sometimes are cooperating with other people, and we're only doing what we're doing as part of our doing what, well, I'm only doing what I'm doing as part of our doing what we are doing. That's when I'm playing in an orchestra or I'm playing on a sports team. I'm not just throwing the ball at the batter, I'm the pitcher, and as the pitcher, I'm doing certain things in cooperation with other people. Anyway, that's the problem of collective intentionality. All right, now last time I gave you a sort of set-piece lecture on intentionality, and I didn't say anything that really isn't in the reading, but it's important that you understand it. And I even printed out this little sheet. Did anybody not bring theirs along? Why not just pass this back for anybody who wants to? Can I see a show of hands if you don't have it? All right, here you go. And pass them back to the boys in the back room. Just keep passing them back, and anybody who wants one, hang on to one. Yeah. Okay. And an awful lot of the stuff is on this sheet, so let me go over some of the points. We get a certain picture of rational human action, and not all of the features of that picture are on this sheet, and we'll say more about it when we get to rationality. But the idea is that you have reasons for action. For example, beliefs and desires. Now, not all reasons are beliefs and desires. We'll get to that. Sometimes you act on an obligation even though you don't especially want to do the thing you're under an obligation to do. All this thing, the obligation is the reason for doing it. Okay, now the belief and the desire lead to the formation of a prior intention. And the moment when that prior intention is formed is called a decision. You make up your mind that you're going to do something. And then the decision characteristically leads to the formation of an intention in action. I'll just abbreviate all that. And you know the intention in action is the mental component of the action. It's the trying. And the intention in action then causes a bodily movement. And this total picture here is the action. The action consists of the intention in action plus the bodily movement. Now, it's perfectly possible to have an action with no prior intention. Normally when I'm in a conversation, I just say whatever comes into my head. There are a class of people who always think in advance what they're going to say. There's a technical name for them. They're called bores. The bore is a guy who's always thinking, what is he going to say? I was once in Brazil lecturing there, and there was a visiting guy from UCLA, a linguist, and he had this thing that somehow or other I was trying to lay a trap for him. So whenever I asked him a question, he always took a long time to think about it. You know, what's the bear trap here? Like, how are you? You know, he thought maybe this was a trick question. In any case, an awful lot of stuff we do quite spontaneously. We don't have to have a prior intention to do everything that we do intentionally. Now, let me give you what I think is an uncontroversial example of that. Some people would say, well, really, you have a prior intention to say what you're going to say. But here's a case where I'm pretty sure there is no prior intention. It often happens when I'm thinking about a philosophical problem, and I'll be sitting in a chair, and then suddenly I get up and start pacing around. I think better when I'm walking around. There's some deep foot reason having to do with the flow of blood, why people who pace around often think better than people who don't pace around. Here, you get one of these, no extra charge. Okay, now I jump up and start pacing around, but guess what? When I was sitting there thinking about the problem of referential opacity, I wasn't thinking any second I'm going to get up and pace around. I wasn't thinking about that at all. I just hauled off and did it. That's a case where I did something intentionally. I had an intention and action which caused a bodily movement where the total action consists of the intention and action plus the bodily movement, where there is this causal relation. All of these relations are causal, where I had the cause of the in that case, I had an intention and action which caused a bodily movement, but I didn't have this stuff. I did not have a prior intention. All right. Now, however, in the philosopher's favorite example of rationality, you reflect on your reasons for an action, you make a decision, and then you have the onset of the action, and the whole structure is causal from beginning to end. That is the standard textbook account. Indeed, on Davidson's conception of an action just is any bodily movement that's caused in the right way by a belief and a desire. I think that's wrong. You have to have a prior intention in there. The belief and desire don't function unless they result in an intention. However, that neat picture is messed up by two things. One is between the belief and the desire, and between the decision and the onset of the action, there's a gap. And there's a causal gap in the typical case where we do not think of ourselves as being determined, where we think, well, these are my reasons for voting for that guy, but all the same, I might vote for the other guy. I could vote for the opposing candidate. Or, having made up my mind, I get into the ballot booth and I just can't do it. I just don't do the thing I decided to do. And I told you last time the name of that gap is called the freedom of the will. And I don't know whether or not we have free will, but one thing I'm confident of, we all have the experience of acting freely. We have the experience where we sense, well, I'm doing this, but I could be doing that. I ordered the veal scallopini, but I could have ordered the boeuf bourguignon. They both looked reasonably attractive. I wasn't determined. There was nobody holding a gun to my head. I wasn't compelled or otherwise acting unfreely. I had this illusion of freedom, but maybe it's just an illusion. Maybe there's no fact corresponding to it. Now, when we get into that problem, we'll have to ask, well, what would the world be like if free will were not an illusion, and what's it like if it is an illusion? But in any case, as far as our experiences are concerned, we cannot avoid the presupposition of free will. So on the little chart I gave you, there's an asymmetry that's not marked, and that is there's no freedom on the left-hand side. You don't have a freedom of perception. In philosophy, there's no problem about the freedom of perception. I'm seeing my hand, but who knows, maybe I could see something else. No, if it's like this, I don't have a choice. On the other hand, if I raise my right arm, or I raise my left arm, or I don't raise either arm at all, that's up to me. I have complete free will, or so it seems to me. I have the experience of free will, and now the question is there anything that corresponds to that? And as you all know, there's a deep inconsistency in our worldview, because on the one hand, we want to say, well, look, everything that happens has got a causal explanation. Everything. If I raise my hand right now, then that must have been determined by antecedent causes stretching back 15 billion years to the time of the Big Bang. So at the time, this is a wonderful picture. At the time of the Big Bang, when the universe was formed, it was written in the book of history that at that moment, on the 7th of September, in that room, Searle's right arm was going to go up. You see, now that's got to be a hell of a big book, the book of history in which all that is written. But that's the picture we have, is that everything that happens is determined by antecedently sufficient causal conditions. And Immanuel Kant said we couldn't think about reality if we didn't think of it as in that way determined. Now, as usual, Kant cheats like crazy. You get to be a philosophical genius or allowed to cheat, and here's the cheat that he makes. He says, of course we can't think of this except as being determined, but that's in the phenomenal world, in the world of appearances. Whereas in the world of things in themselves, the Ding an sich. Beware of Germans saying Ding an sich. That's the one message I want to get across to you. The Ding an sich. In that world, it's completely free. I have Freiheit in the world of the in the noumenal world. Germans, that makes a Greek and German, that's deep trouble. But anyway, in the noumenal world of the Ding an sich, I am completely free. So Kant gets it both ways. You have free will, but everything's determined. Well, thanks a lot. I mean, that's no help to me at all. But anyway, we'll get to that when we talk about the problem of free will. Okay, so this neat picture is muddled by two things. The experience of free will. Now, one way to see that is to contrast it with cases where you did not have the experience of free will, where you felt yourself in the grip of an emotion. You were overcome with rage, or whatever's your favorite overcoming emotion, or a case where your bodily movements weren't up to you. That is, when I'm raising my arm, I think it's up to me. I could raise the right arm or the left arm. But if I fall off a building, I think, well, I'm going toward the ground, but I could do something else. You know, what the hell? I don't have to keep moving toward the ground. No, it's not up to me. That's a case where I'm completely determined. And I'm sorry to say, there are cases where we sense ourselves as not acting freely. But in the normal case where I'm making up my mind what to order in the restaurant or who to vote for in the election, it's up to me. I can act freely. All right, now that's one complexity. Another complexity is I've made it look as if there's this very simple pattern whereby the intention and action causes the bodily movement. But of course, for anything complicated, you want to write a great book, or you want to get married to a Republican, or what's your favorite project, and pick a project, then you'll find you have to do a whole lot of things, and it stretches over time. Now, I gave you a simple project, Gavrilo Princip's assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and what we found is there are different levels of description, and they're real, and they're all encompassed by the intention and action. He intends to pull the trigger, he intends to fire the gun, he intends to shoot the Archduke, and so on. But those are not three different actions. That's one action described at different levels of descriptions, where the descriptions describe the actual conditions of satisfaction of his complex intention in action. So in the purest case, he has an intention and action. I will pull the trigger, and by pulling the trigger, I will fire the gun. I will fire the gun, and by firing the gun, I'll shoot the Archduke. I will shoot the Archduke, and by shooting the Archduke, I'll kill the Archduke. By killing the Archduke, I will strike a blow against Austria, and indeed the whole two-eagled, two-headed empire. And furthermore, by striking a blow against Austria, I will avenge Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and all the other good guys who need to be avenged. That's his complex intention and action. Now, that's not 6 different intentions. That's one intention with different levels. And now what we discovered is there are 2 parts to that, 2 parts of that complex level. And the 2 parts to the complex intention are the causal by means of relation and the constituted by way of relation. So by pulling the trigger, he fires the gun, because pulling the trigger causes the gun to fire. That is a causal relation. But by striking a blow against Austria, he doesn't cause Serbia to be avenged. That just constitutes avenging Serbia. That's what it is in that context, to avenge Serbia. So this is a constitutive relation, and this is a causal relation. And these constitutive relations are going to be very common where human social behavior is concerned. Think of the obvious cases. I now make noises through my mouth. Those noises don't cause me to say things. They are saying things. They constitute saying things. And saying those things constitutes giving a lecture on the philosophy of society. And much of social reality is like that. You vote in an election by raising your hand. Raising your hand doesn't cause you to vote. Rather, it is constitutive. In that context, raising your hand just was voting. Does everybody see that? That you have these two different levels. And I haven't explored this, but my hypothesis is that what works in the instantaneous case, it's just one act where you pull the trigger and fired the gun and killed the Archduke and all that sort of stuff, that works, that those two relations work over long periods of time. I'm writing a book on the philosophy of language, and I do various things that are causally related, like hitting the keys on my computer, but there are others that are constitutive, like, for example, finishing chapter 1, and that doesn't cause me to work toward the completion of the book. That constitutes completing that much of the book. That would be the hypothesis, is that these two features, the causal relations and the constitutive relations, work for actions across time. Okay, now all of that is the picture that I want you to feel comfortable with. Now then, we get a messy feature. Or maybe it's not messy, maybe it's great. And that is collective intentionality, where you do something not just on your own, but you do it by way of cooperating with other people. And this is there's now a whole lot of work done on collective intentionality. Indeed, there's a biennial conference called Collective Intentionality. I just got back from Basel. I can prove it. I have a Basel symbol on my baseball cap. I lost my good baseball cap, and I hate the ones that have speech acts on them. This one, at least, nobody knows what it means. It's the Basel City symbol. All right, so you're all informed of that. But in any case, they have a biennial conference. They had one 2 years ago in Berkeley, and before that in Rotterdam, and before that in Helsinki, and this year in Basel. I don't know where it's going to be 2 years from now. Do you? And where? Spain. Where? Donde? In Madrid. Where? Okay, all right. But anyway, it'll be somewhere. All right. Now, this is collective intentionality, and all these guys get together collectively to intentionally discuss the problem of collective intentionality. And that's an interesting question. The question is, if all intentionality that I have is in my head, and all you have is in your head, how the hell can there be such a thing as collective intentionality? Now, there is a traditional answer to that in a certain kind of philosophy that says, well, it's because we are part of a larger unity. There's a Geist. Yeah, some nonsense sounds better in German. Geist is German for soul or mind. There's a Geist that is overhead, and that's the objektiver Geist, as Hegel called it. So each of us persists in this heavy-duty Germanische Geist. And I don't believe that, but I think you got a problem here. The problem is that you want to be able to say, on the one hand, collective intentionality is real and irreducible. You can't get rid of the we by saying it's just I plus I plus I plus I. There really is an irreducible collective intentionality on the one hand, and yet you want to say all intentionality has to be in individual heads. There's no form of intentionality that's outside the heads of actual human individuals. Okay, I'm going to get to that. And that gave me a lot of trouble. That article called Collective Intention and Action was a hard one to write, because I have to figure out how can the collectivity be irreducible, and yet it's got to move my body. You see, in collective intentionality, you typically, in a large enough group, you don't know what the other people are doing. You know you're cooperating, but you're playing the violin in the orchestra, and you don't know what the French horn player, what notes the French horn player is going to hit while you're sawing away on your violin. You just know that you're all cooperating together. So it can't be a requirement of collective intentionality that each individual knows what all the other people are doing. All they have to know is that you're cooperating. And this can be quite massive. The German army in the Second World War made it a requirement that nobody should know more than was necessary to carry out his particular assignment. So you had these absurd situations where somebody could be a field marshal and not, I mean, that's a big deal in the German army, and not know the overall strategic situation. Indeed, when Paulus surrendered at Stalingrad, he had no idea what the overall strategic situation was. Now, at the last minute, they made him a field marshal. Why? They made him a field marshal because no German field marshal had ever surrendered to the enemy in the entire history of Germany. Guess what Paulus did? He surrendered immediately, thus destroying the whole point of promoting him to this advanced pay grade. He didn't get the pay anyway. But in any case, I don't know how we got off on the Second World War, but it's a massive case of collective intentionality. The point I'm making now is you have to describe the intentionality in the individual's head, what makes it clear that it's irreducibly collective, but at the same time makes it clear that the individual is making an individual contribution to the collective effort and may not even know what the other people, the contribution the other people are making. To take a simpler kind of case, if we're a football team executing a pass play, and I am an offensive lineman, my job is just to block the defensive end. I don't know what routes the receivers are running, and I don't know how many steps back the quarterback is taking. All I know is I have an assignment. Keep the guy from knocking down your quarterback to the count of 4. And then, they do the 4, and then, okay, then you've done your assignment. If he knocks down the quarterback, well, that's the quarterback's fault. But in any case, that's how it works in real life, is that you do your assignment, and you may not know what other people are doing. Now, we're going to say more about that. Okay, but now I'm going to stop talking about intentionality for a few minutes and talk about the background, which is a mess, and I put it off as long as I could, but we got to talk about it at some point. So let's take questions. I want everybody to understand this chart. Is there anything on the chart you don't understand? I put it this way because you get this beautiful symmetry between cognition and volition. Don't be dismayed by these old-fashioned pompous terms. The idea is basically the two different directions of fit. Cognition is supposed to represent how things are in the world, and volition is supposed to determine changes in the world. One describes the world, the other one changes it. And the fact that the arrows run the way they do is a very deep philosophical importance, and let me make it fully clear. In the case of perception and memory, you have a presentation or a representation of how things are in the world, and thus, if successful, you achieve mind-to-world direction of fit. But it's fundamental to our conception of how we relate to reality that in those cases you achieve the mind-to-world direction of fit only in virtue of the world-to-mind direction of causation. It's only because things really are that way that you can correctly see them that way, and their being that way has to cause you to see them that way. Otherwise, you don't actually see them that way. You're just having a guess or a lucky hallucination. Now, that's the cognitive side. On the volitional side, it's exactly the opposite. It's a beautiful asymmetry, and the asymmetry is this. It's fundamental to our notion of human action that you succeed in doing the thing you're trying to do, or in carrying out your prior intention, and thus achieve the world-to-mind direction of fit only if you're planning, that's the prior intention, or trying, that's the intention and action, cause the behavior that constitutes changing the world. So you achieve the world-to-mind direction of fit only in virtue of mind-to-world direction of causation. Now, if there's one thing I want you to understand that point, that you get an asymmetry between cognition on the one hand, which tells you how the world is, and volition, where you're actually trying to change the world or planning how to change the world on the other hand, but it's perfectly symmetrical. It matches the symmetries between the sensory nervous system and the motor nervous system The sensory nervous system is supposed to enable you to get accurate information about the world. The motor nervous system enables you to change it. What this does is to capture the causal and intentional components along with the conditions of satisfaction. Now, later on, we'll get into intentional causation. You will not understand society until you understand the role of intentional causation. It's because in collective intentionality, you have cooperative forms of causes. We all get together and collectively vote for Obama, and that then causes him to become president, is our collective effort. Collective intentionality is crucial to understanding the operation of society and the operation of social movements. Okay, so I haven't told you yet how collective intentionality works, but I want you to see that there is interesting problems about it, and I want you to see the symmetries and asymmetries on this chart. Questions about everything I said today or about last time, for that matter? Yeah. I can't hear you very well. I'm going deaf in my old age.
Do you have a subconscious intention?
Yes, okay. Now, I haven't talked about the dreadful problem of the unconscious, and it is a problem, and often there are unconscious intentions. You have a lot of things that you are unconscious of for two sets of reasons. One is there's some things you do intentionally that you're just not thinking about. I'm walking with a bunch of friends. We're arguing about a philosophical problem, and I find myself stepping around a puddle. I'm not thinking about the puddle. That's at a very low level of my consciousness. It may be indeed be unconscious. More dramatically, there are the Freudian cases of repression, and there are collective repressions, as well as individual repressions. The individual repressions are the more obvious ones. After the dinner party, the wife tells her husband, "Why were you so rude to the host?" And the husband says, "Rude? Me rude? I wasn't rude at all. I just pointed out that his last article contained 17 plagiarisms of my work. And besides, the only original things in it were entirely false. Who's rude? Nothing rude about that." So that's a standard sort of academic manifestation of academic hostility, and a lot of those cases are unconscious. Nothing dramatic about it. It isn't that the guy's got some deep sexual repression. He probably has that too, but you don't have to have that to get in the ballgame of unconscious hostilities and unconscious desires. Now, we're going to have a problem about emotions, and I'm going to have to talk about the emotions. Why do we have the notion of an emotion at all? I mean, why don't we just stay with beliefs and desires in perfectly respectable and intentional states? And the answer is it's because the emotions move us. That's what the word means, etymological. A moverare, as we would say in Latin, meaning to move out. And the emotions do move us to forms of behavior, not all of which are rational. And when we get into rationality, one of the things we'll have to talk about is the relation of rationality and the emotions. See, there's a traditional view that says rationality is constantly at war with the emotions. But there's a good book by Antonio Damasio called Descartes' Error, where he points out, no, look, without any emotions, you can't really be rational. You have to have some emotional drive in order to give rationality any purchase at all. Hume would have loved that. Reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions, Hume famously said. All right, so there's my account so far is neutral about whether or not the intentional states are conscious or unconscious. Other questions? Yes. Yeah, you're entitled to two. Go ahead.
So in this whole action picture, I'm a little confused about unintentional actions versus non-action.
Yeah, right.
Is an unintentional action can only be caused as like a side effect of an intentional action, right? Or what would that be?
Okay, here's the picture that is standard in the literature, and I think it's probably due to Davidson. But I'm glad you asked the question because I want to modify the picture slightly. Whenever you do anything, there are lots of things that happen that are not part of the content of your intention in action. Those are typically called unintentional actions. And the favorite example is Oedipus marrying his girlfriend and simultaneously marrying Jocasta. One marriage is intentional. He married Jocasta intentionally. One marriage is unintentional. He married his mother unintentionally. But there's only one action. Whatever problems he had, he wasn't a bigamist. He got one marriage, and under one description, it's intentional, and on another description, it's unintentional. Now, the standard philosophical account says, well, it's just under a description, but we want to know what facts do the descriptions describe. And on my account, they describe the contents of the intention and action. The action is intentional under those descriptions that describe the actual intention and action that was carried out. It's unintentional under those descriptions that do not describe the contents of the intention and action. You got that? Okay, now I think that's right so far. Now there are two puzzles about that. One is, what about cases that are, so to speak, not even in the ballpark? I mean, when I was walking back and forth here, I was altering the gravitational relation between my right elbow, and the moon, okay? Because we know the moon has a gravitational field, extends to everything. But was that an unintentional action on my part? I think without some further stage setting, I wouldn't even attribute as an action. It's just something that happened. It wasn't an action. Now suppose, however, there was a law that said, you're not allowed to alter the gravitational attractions between your elbow and the moon at such and such a time on Tuesday afternoon. Then I might plead, oh, sorry, Your Honor, it was unintentional. Okay, then I might do it then. But then, so to speak, it becomes part of the background. It becomes a background possibility. Okay, so that's one difficulty. I don't know how to make the distinction between unintentional actions and things that just happen. Now, a second difficulty is I want to say there can be unintentional actions even if there was no intention in action. You see, my examples are all cases where there was an intention in action that had unintended consequences. But how about the cases where you weren't performing an action at all? You just fell out of bed and smashed the vase that was on the table by the side of the bed. It wasn't that you were performing an intentional action. Just something that you did unintentionally. So you don't have to be performing an intentional action to perform an unintentional action. Okay, go ahead.
So it's still an action even if there's no intention in action?
No. Here is, I think partly we're forced to reform ordinary language slightly. I want to say a human action is any event that contains an intention in action. It's an unintentional happening, I should say maybe, rather than an unintentional action, if the event that happened was not included as part of the conditions of satisfaction of the intention and action. And it's an unintentional action if there was a trying, if there was an action that had unintentional consequences. How does that sound? Does that sound pretty good? Think about it. If you can find a refutation of it, let me know. Okay, any other questions? Are you on board? Yes?
Obviously, these ideas are getting confused. But when Oedipus marries Jocasta and his mother, is that an action? Him marrying his mother?
Yes, he intentionally married Jocasta. That action, however, has a description under which it was not intended. He married his mother. So he performed the intentional action of marrying Jocasta, the unintentional action of marrying his mother, and he only performed one action. It had one feature that was intended, and another feature was not intended. Now, that sounds kind of obvious to me. Does that sound okay to you? I don't see anything wrong with that.
Yeah, it's just, I just have trouble with the notion that we were talking about this last week, that actions have propositional content.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with that.
The intention of action has propositional content, but the bodily motion itself goes far beyond that and has nothing approaching propositional content.
Yeah, I want to say it obviously has propositional content. So this is an important point. Let me spell it out. What intentional states do is set conditions. A condition of succeeding in the case of trying. A condition of getting it right in the case of perception. A condition of truth in the case of belief. A condition of fulfillment in the case of a desire or an intention. And now, this is the key point. Trivially, any condition is a condition that. and that means it's propositional. When people say it's propositional, they think it must be a big deal that you're busy thinking about the propositional calculus and performing truth functional operations. Not at all. A trivial consequence of the fact that there are conditions on intentionality is that there are propositional conditions, because a condition is always a condition that such and such. It's a condition that such and such should occur. So if I'm trying to raise my arm, then that intention action has a condition. Namely, the arm has to go up, and furthermore, the intention has to cause it to go up. But that's trivially propositional. I think people think, well, if it's propositional, you must be conscious of it. You must be thinking about it. Not so. You're not thinking about that at all when you raise your arm. Jennifer, yeah.
Intended actions have to be things that you could intentionally do.
Well, that's what I think is probably the case. Yeah.
The example where you roll out of the bed when you're asleep
Yeah.
is really marginal.
Okay.
You could, if you're awake, say, this might be a fun thing to try.
Yeah.
Rolling out of the bed and falling on the floor. But while you're asleep, that seems like a strange thing to say that was an unintended action.
We'll leave out the word action. I broke the vase unintentionally. Is that okay?
That's fine.
All right, okay. And that satisfies your worry, too, I think. There was no action if I just rolled out of bed. But I did something unintentionally, which means I did it without intending to do it. And your point about, I guess, altering my gravitational relations to the moon is that's not a possible action. I mean, we could fiddle with a background and make it one, and so that it would become a possible intention and action. Okay, a lot of hands up. First you, then you. Yeah.
So you mentioned the example about like the French horn player doesn't really know what the violin player is.
Right. Yeah, right.
But like in an orchestra, there's like a conductor. So you
Yes.
obviously know
He better know what's going
you
on.
wouldn't really be an orchestra. And similarly, like in an army.
Yeah.
I'm not really familiar with how the army works, but I'm sure someone must know.
Okay, now here's the point. You see, even the general doesn't know that at 5 in the afternoon I'm peeling potatoes to feed the division. Even the general doesn't know that. The general has an overall, and incidentally, the military has to be somewhat efficient, so they do such things as, who are you responsible to? And normally, there are the general has a limited number of people that are actually answer to him, and then each of them has a whole bunch of people that answer to them. The general doesn't know what the private is doing, but he should know what all of the colonels are responsible for, so that he can check on the fact that they're carrying out their responsibilities. So organizations typically have a flow chart, and they make a distinction between lines of responsibility and staff, where the staff just advises the guy or the woman who is the responsible person at his level. But it's not the case even for massive movements like a military movement that there's any single person who knows the intentionality of everybody. You couldn't. It's too big a deal. I mean, this is a problem for American political parties, because the head of the political party typically doesn't know what all the other characters that are supposedly under the political party are saying. And recently, the head of the Republican National Committee made an obvious idiotic mistake, which spoke directly contrary to Republican policy, and they shut him up right away. I mean, they jumped on him. But so you have to enforce some degree of conformity. But in American political organizations are much looser than corresponding European political parties. So there's all sorts of independence that you don't get in the British Labour Party, for example. Yes.
Last thing, do you see it? I don't understand why you see a important distinction between something like unintentionally contradicting the platform of the Republican Party, or unintentionally hurting your mother, and unintentionally changing your relationship to the gravity of the moon.
Yeah.
It seems like,
It's a continuum.
Well, yeah, like
Yeah.
we could potentially make hay out of one.
Yeah. Well, it may well be a continuum between what is in the ballpark as a possible action and what is not. That would be something to think about. But I do want a distinction in general, and this is fundamental to understanding human behavior, between the condition of satisfaction of the intention and action and all kinds of other things that happen. And if you examine social movements, or you examine public policy, there's always the law of unintended consequences, and people seldom learn from their actual mistakes or from the past. So, for example, when the United States invaded Iraq, they had a certain set of intentions and a certain set of plans. Now, all kinds of other things happened that were not part of the intentional content, and some of those could have been predicted, but they were, in fact, not predicted. Worst case, of course, was the Vietnam War, where they had a certain set of intentions, and all kinds of other things happened on the ground that were not part of the intentional content. Now, one of the things that we're going to have to talk about when we talk about collective behavior is the role of the background. You see, the background determines how you will perceive your own behavior and the behavior of your adversaries. And often, if people have an inadequate background, they misperceive. One of my favorites is during the 1930s, Hitler was amazed that Roosevelt didn't seek Anschluss with Canada. Why didn't the United States annex Canada? He would have annexed Canada. Now, if you told, say, Congress, I've decided to annex Canada, they'd think you were gone crazy. It would be a joke. It's just not part of the background. It's not a background possibility. Well, Hitler would say, yeah, but you have a bigger army than the Canadians. You could surely annex them. They all speak your language. It's not going to be a problem once you get them annexed. It's just not a possibility. It's a joke to talk about annexing Canada, and that's because the background is different. It's just simply out of the question. And what the background does is figure out what are possibilities. Now, incidentally, this is what revolutionaries do. They try to outrage the background. They try to challenge the background in ways that are just outrageous. So why did Lenin murder the Romanov family, the emperor and his family? And as far as I can tell, the reason is he wanted to show they meant business, that they would do something outrageous, atrocious, and monstrous just to prove we're really serious about this revolution. So we're going to kill all these bewildered, not very intelligent people, all these poor, overweight women with all their jewelry strapped to their underwear were routinely slaughtered. As not in spite of the fact that it ran against background, but precisely because of the fact that it was an outrage, that it would be perceived as an outrage. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the dreaded background. Any more questions, though, at this point? I want to make sure everybody is up with this, and I want you to have a grip on the basic theory of intentionality, so that when we get to collective intentionality, you won't be puzzled. You won't be puzzled by, well, how can there be these conditions of satisfaction and so on. And just to tell you where we're going, the idea is this. To create human civilization, you need really a very limited number of tools. You need collective intentionality, and you need the assignment of a certain type of function where the function cannot be performed in virtue of the physical structure of the object or entity alone. See, this performs its function, this piece of chalk, in virtue of its physical structure. I rub it against the blackboard and it makes a mark. But this money in my pocket, it doesn't perform its function in virtue of its physical structure. There's nothing in the paper molecules or the ink stains on the dollar bill that make it, well, it's European money, but it doesn't matter, that make it function as a 10-euro note. It's not the physics that enables it to function, but what? The fact that there is a collective acceptance that it has a certain status, and with that status there's a function that can be performed only in virtue of that collective acceptance. So to understand human civilization, you need the notion of collective intentionality, the assignment of function, and the assignment of a class of functions which require collective acceptance of a certain status. Those are what I call status functions. And that's what we're working toward. We're working toward developing the apparatus so that I can give you a general theory of that. Right now, we're still developing the theory of intentionality and the theory of the background. Okay, any other questions? If not, yes, you had your hand up. Yeah. Is about what? Yeah, sure thing. I charge rather heavy rate of interest, and I insist on some security. Your driver's license will do as security. Okay, what else?
My second one is, you mentioned that you could have an intention and action without a prior intention.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Those are called spontaneous actions.
Okay, and that could be a result of the compulsion, somatic.
Yeah, just haul off and do it. Yeah.
So, does that open up the possibility maybe of a spectrum of liminal kind of lack of intentionality?
Yeah. Well, I don't think so. Whenever I present this idea to professional philosophers that you can have an intention and action without a prior intention, typically there's some guy who said, well, you must have had a teeny weensy prior intention, a real little guy that you couldn't detect, you were unconscious of it. Why? Why do I have to have that? Now, there is an interesting point, though, and that is typically these spontaneous actions will be the result of some much more general prior intention. So it's true in a conversation. I say a lot of things that are absolutely unplanned. I didn't intend to say that, and I may regret saying it afterwards. But I did intend to have a conversation. So I had an overall project of having a conversation, and then within that, I made a whole lot of spontaneous moves that were intentional moves. And remember, the mark of the intentionality is the mark of the condition of satisfaction. What were you trying to do? And I was trying to say that. I said those things intentionally. Okay, well, let's talk about the background. All right, now here's the picture that we've been developing. You have these intentional states. At any given point, some of them are conscious, though the conscious ones exist alongside a whole bunch of unconscious ones. And that just means they're things you're not thinking about. Even when I'm sound asleep, I still believe that Barack Obama is president and that the United States is a republic. And there is a fact about me that makes it the case that I think that, but it's not a conscious fact. I'm not thinking about those things then and there. So you have all these intentional states, and they can be conscious, but at any given point, many of them, maybe most of them, are not conscious. Okay, now the question arises, well, how does it work? And one of the elements I've said you need to make it work is if you're going to think that I have these intentional states, they only work because they're related to a whole lot of other intentional states. So I believe that Barack Obama is president, but I have to believe a whole lot of other stuff in order to believe that. I have to believe the United States is a republic. It has elections every 4 years, that the elections are typically fought by the two major parties, and you really don't have a chance of becoming elected president unless you're a candidate of one of the two major parties, and so on. So if this is the belief that Obama is president, it only functions because of its relation to a whole lot of other elements of the network. And what does that mean, it only functions? It only determines the conditions of satisfaction that it does. It only identifies the state of affairs that it does because of its relation to a whole lot of other intentional states. I have a whole lot of other beliefs and desires and attitudes that enable that state to function. And think of the guy deciding to run for the presidency. You know, everybody's telling him, well, you ought to wait 4 years. It's not your turn. And he says to himself, no, I'm going to run for the presidency now. Now, in order to have that intentional state, he's got to have a lot of other beliefs and desires. He's got to desire that people vote for him, that people contribute money to his campaign, that people are willing to work for him in the campaign. So not all beliefs, but he has to have this whole network of other states. To the extent that he doesn't have those, then no matter what he says, it would not be the intention to run for the presidency. If he thought, we say, well, what does that involve, running for the presidency? And he says, well, the way I understand it is, everybody who wants to be president gets at the top of a big grassy hill, and they roll down a hill, grabbing a mouthful of grass at each roll. And when they get to the bottom, the guy with the most grass is president. Isn't that how it works? And we tell them, no, you didn't understand it. If you think that's how you get to be president, you're in a different ballpark. Wrong network, wrong set of assumptions. All right, but now then, if you listed all these assumptions, philosophers like to say et cetera, but that's the et cetera of laziness. I mean, tell us what they are, and then what you find is you can't really list everything. After a while, you'd get a bunch of propositions that look funny if you list them as further assumptions. Is it a belief that Obama has that typically voters are conscious when they vote? Well, if I thought they were all going to be unconscious, I'd run a different kind of campaign. God knows what it would look like, but it would be different. Or that elections are held at or near the surface of the earth. If I thought elections only went on the moon, then again, I'd run a different kind of campaign. How are we going to get the voters to the polling place on the moon? A different kind of campaign. But it seems to me it's best to think of those as taken for granted presuppositions. And the network then shades off into a sort of a background of things that are taken for granted. And then particularly, you take for granted that you have certain abilities. You can cope with people. You know how to relate to people. You have a certain set of abilities for coping and dealing with people. And I'm suspicious of these neat little diagrams, but this is the way I like to think of it, that the network only functions against a background of things that are not, so to speak, explicit beliefs and desires and other intentional states. It functions against a background of what's taken for granted, including skills. It's this background of stuff that is completely taken for granted, and it's hard to specify the elements of the background precisely because it doesn't consist of a set of propositions. It consists of a kind of set of stances, ways of behaving, dispositions, habits, cultural and biological know-how, just ways of coping. Now, there isn't much that's any good that's written on the background, but the thing that influenced me most, and the thing that I think is the best thing written, is Wittgenstein's On Certainty. And he writes about a particular role of the background, and that is the role of the background in epistemology. This is his book On Certainty. And there are other guys who write about the background. Pierre Bourdieu has the notion of what he calls the habitus, and I think that is like my notion of the background. The only thing is, Bourdieu writes, I'm sorry to say, in ways that are pretty much, well, I won't say unintelligible, but they are very hard to understand. One year I taught this course and I assigned Bourdieu's book, The Logic of Practice. I really liked him. He was a terrific guy and a good friend of mine and perfectly clear in conversation. It's just when he wrote a book, it came out as French fog. It just came out as very obscure. And the habitus is a useful notion, but it's a notion, and it's like my notion of the background. It's the way, it doesn't mean habit, it means habitation. It is the habitation of people, that they have this habitus which enables them to cope with the world. And he points out, when you tell a little kid, stand up straight, behave better, you are inculcating a habitus. You're inculcating the background. Why did he write so badly? He was perfectly clear in conversation. Well, I asked Michel Foucault the same question when he was teaching in Berkeley. He was a smart guy. And I was having lunch with him once, and I said, Pourquoi tu écris si mal? Why do you write so badly? And he said, we were speaking French, he said his English was atrocious. It was good, but he couldn't pronounce it. I can pronounce French, it's just otherwise it's atrocious. But anyway, he said, if I wrote as clearly as you do, people in Paris would say, c'est enfantin. I mean, it's naive. It's childish and naive to try to say things so clearly. And I said, come on, you're pulling my leg. Tu te moques un peu de moi. And he said, no. En France, il faut avoir au moins 10% incompréhensible. Yeah, in France, you have to have at least 10% incomprehensible. Otherwise, people won't take it seriously. They won't think you're a deep thinker at all. Well, I didn't know if that was right, so when I was lecturing as a guest of Bourdieu at the Collège de France in Paris, I told Bourdieu this story and asked him, is Foucault just joking? He said, no. He got very excited. He said, no, that's absolutely right. It's more than 10%. It's more like 20%. And when you read Bourdieu, yes, you think it is quite a lot more than 10%. Anyway, something happened in French intellectual life, and I guessed who the hell was responsible for it. It could have been Bergson. I don't know. When did they... You see, there was a period, none of you are old enough to remember it. In my childhood, there was a slogan, "Ce qui n'est pas clair n'est pas français." If it's not clear, it's not French. Well, that has long since been forgotten. I mean, you think Bourdieu and Foucault are bad, try Derrida. But in any case, there was I don't know how we got off onto this, but I'm going to talk more about the background in a minute. There was a period of obscurantism that came over French intellectual life under, I think, the influence of the Germans. I mean, you read a lot of Hegel, and a whole lot of things happen to you. But in any case, there was a kind of obscurantism that did take over. Now, it's true, most of those guys didn't read Hegel himself. That would be too much. They read a book called Introduction de la lecture de Hegel, Introduction to the Reading of Hegel, and I forget the name of the guy that wrote that, but he had a huge influence. What's his name? Yeah, Kojève. Somebody's a scholar here. Pierre Kojève. Ça se prononce. And Kojève wrote this book, and everybody read that, but it's as bad as Hegel. I've tried to read it several times and never made it through. It's spelled this way. Kojève, Introduction à la lecture de Hegel. You can't do the H. Hegel. Anyway, if you write that badly, you find yourself in bed with a whole lot of Germans whose names start with H. For reasons that are unclear to me. But all right, so we're getting on to the background, and I'm suggesting that there are other authors that write about this, and I think the best is Wittgenstein. But let me give you some obvious examples that there has to be such a phenomenon. It is a familiar cliche to say that you can learn more about human beings and their psyche from reading Shakespeare and Dostoevsky than you can from taking a university course in psychology. Now, I think that's probably right. The important thing to remember is it's not a criticism of university psychology courses. They're not trying to do what Dostoevsky and Shakespeare were trying to do. Dostoevsky had a different set of intellectual objectives. I mean, I am sure it's true to say you can learn a lot more about ethics by reading those guys than if you took a university course in a philosophy department in ethics. That's probably true as well. Well, what is it then that you get from reading, let's say, Dostoevsky?